the conversation to put your video on and talk to us if that's available to you, if that's comfortable for you, because one of the things we want to do is set up a kind of round table feeling here today. But in the meantime, please stretch, make yourself comfortable, and we'll start in about 30 to 60 seconds. All right, is there anyone else in the waiting room?
I've turned the waiting room off at this point, so anyone that joins
perfect.
just automatically flies in.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so then we'll go ahead and start. I want to remind everyone that this event is being recorded. It is great to see you all, but if you don't consent to being recorded, please keep your videos off for the duration of the panel. My name is Natalie Lovelace, and I have the honor of opening and moderating a panel here today. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Art and Design, where I teach contemporary art and theory, and I direct a lab called the Research Creation and Social Justice Collaboratory. I'm going to put the link to that in the chat, and throughout my opening remarks, I'll be putting links in the chat in order to kind of give you access to different pieces of information on our panelists and on some of the things that I'm talking about. So the University of Alberta and the Research Creation and Social Justice Collaboratory, these two units, they are on Treaty 6 territory. It's their home. Amistwitziwaskagan, or Beaver Hills House, which is also known as Edmonton in Western Canada, for those of you who are not from around here. It's a really particular thing that we've experienced over the course of pandemic to gesture towards treaty and land acknowledgement on Zoom when we're widely dispersed, and our encounter is made possible by server farms that are located on occupied lands that I, for one, don't know how to trace. It's also a particular thing to do a treaty acknowledgement here today in the context of Congress. It's now customary to acknowledge the historical injustices of the settler colonial state within university spaces, virtual or otherwise. And when we make such acknowledgements in events like this, it also has become customary for us to say that it matters, that it not be rehearsed as, or even unconsciously normalized into a tokenistic act. This is something that I struggle with. I struggle with every time I offer acknowledgement. What to acknowledge and how. As a settler, living and working in Treaty 6 for the past 9 years, born and bred in Jojage, Montreal, unceded lands of the Kinaschuk Nation, where I grew up as a descendant amongst other settler and immigrant lines. I grew up a descendant of Lithuanian Jews who came through Ellis Island at the turn of the 20th century, and of the Acadians of Port Royal in Nova Scotia, who settled there in the mid-1600s. As a daughter of that lineage, I grew up in Jojage amongst massive Franco-Anglo settler infighting that was marked by Indigenous erasure and Romanticism, which of course is its own kind of erasure. And I grew up in that context going to elementary and high schools located about 35 kilometers from the Kinaschuk Indian Day School, ignorant of the histories and the presence of the lands that I took for granted, and kept ignorant by pedagogical curricula that centered the genocidal truisms of the settler state. So today, I acknowledge these settler and kinship lines, the lands where I was born and grew up, as well as those I live and work on now. And while I can't name the 215 children whose bones were left hidden at Kamloops Residential School, I will name the sites of the two closest schools to where I now sit: St. Albert Indian Residential School and the Youville Indian Residential School, both closed in 1948 and located a little more than 20 kilometers away from here, where I'm standing right now. And I'll also name the Charles Camsell Indian Hospital, only 10 kilometers from here, which wasn't closed until 1996. That each of these are sites of genocide that has yet to be fully excavated is something that the University of Alberta, as an agent of the settler state, and all of us who work here have an obligation to address. In this context, I would also like to acknowledge the importance of the Black Canadian Studies Association and others' boycott of Congress this year. The boycott highlights the importance of confronting and reckoning with the profoundly racist discrimination in both Canada's past and its present, and of working to strengthen collective efforts to produce substantive and meaningful anti-racist change in the Academy, both by protesting through strike and through boycott, and by working within the system to center anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-colonial thought and action. Such issues and efforts are urgent ones for all Congress panelists and participants to address, including us here today. So I see acknowledgements such as these rather than as things that we do before starting the real work, as openings onto the very kind of work we understand ourselves to be doing. I see them as requests on the part of the people or the institutions uttering them to be invited to account for any ways, especially unintentional ways, that our work, our words, or actions are contributing to ongoing colonial injustice. And I also see them as declarations of an ongoing commitment to work towards restitution and reparation wherever and however we each can from wherever we are. So I'm inviting us with this opening, with this entry, with this beginning work, to take all of this to heart here today, to take it to heart with compassion and with care and with generosity, as we think together about the value and the capacity of unsettled and dissonant methods that work to reshape the very structure of the Academy that many of us inhabit with our daily lives. So as you'll know from the abstract that drew you here, this panel was born out of a recent U of A press volume, and I'm putting the link in the chat. Dissonant Methods, Undoing Discipline in the Humanities Classroom, edited by Jaarsma and Kit Dobson. It's a timely and insightful book that argues for pedagogical methods that are disruptive, emancipatory, and attuned to social justice. In addition to the need to address decolonization, anti-racism, anti-sexism in the Academy as more than metaphoric, as more than tokenistic, and as more than nominal acts, today's panelists are going to discuss the exigencies of teaching and learning under both COVID and neoliberal austerity measures, such as those that we here at the U of A are currently experiencing in a particularly acute way, which makes it really poignant that Congress is being held here this year. And we are struggling to respond to these within the classroom and without. I'm also going to put into the chat the Association of Academic Staff at the University of Alberta's poignant video that features members of the union telling their personal stories of both the impact of the cuts and the effects on pedagogy and the way that the U of A leadership has been handling this. Many of us, I'm putting this all in here also because many of us came to the Academy with ideas born of transformative pedagogical experiences that formed us. We were called in, hailed into the Academy by these transformative experiences. I certainly did. And my recent monograph and edited volume on research creation, the latter of which I am proud to say is published by the U of A Press. And I'll also put that into the chat. Those two books that I recently booked betray that hailing. They betray that love and commitment for the university as a place of critical transformative pedagogy. And that's why I think Ada and Kit so generously invited me to come here at the beginning and set the tone of the conversation. The implicit question that we are all, I think, here asking is, how do we enact forms of ethical and political pedagogy in the Academy in ways that are accountable the intersecting crises of the present, those that I've just named, and ones that I haven't named? And how do the very methods that we engage in work in service of or against these commitments? In order to begin this really important discussion, I'm going to hand the reins over first to Kit Dobson. As I name each of the panelists, and of course, starting with the editors, I'm going to put their bio link into the chat and maybe ask them to wave. So in order to begin, I'm going to hand the reins over first to Kit Dobson, Professor of Literature in the Department of English, Languages and Cultures at Mount Royal University, who will speak briefly to the book and the theme Dissonant Methods. Following this, Ghada Jaarsma, who is a professor of philosophy in the Department of the Humanities at Mount Royal University, is going to present together with Kinaschuk, who is a doctoral candidate in English at the University of Toronto. Hi, Kyle. We're then going to turn to Sandra Styres, who's a scholar of Danyang English and French descent, who resides on 6 nations of the Grand River Territory and works as an assistant professor of Indigenous education with the Department of Curriculum, Teaching and Learning at Boise. And finally, we're going to hear from Ghada Ageel, who is a visiting professor of political science. And she's the second one down in this list that I put up of postdoctoral fellows at the University of Alberta. And she's a columnist for the Middle East Eye and an editor of Apartheid in Palestine, which is also into the chat, a University of Alberta Press book. After each panelist has offered us their provocation, we're going to open up together with whatever time remains to mutual discussion. And I very much look forward to this. And thank you again, Kit and Ghada, for inviting me to be here with you today. And Kit, I hand the reins over to you.
Great, and thank you so much, Natalie, for that generous, kind, warm opening, as well as I think really pointed one about the times in which we find ourselves, both in terms of the pandemic, but also very much in terms of the university. And so I want to thank you, and I want to thank everyone for being here today. I join you folks from Treaty 7 territory in Southern Alberta, which is the traditional homelands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Stoney Nakoda Nation, and the Tsuut'ina Nation. I live in the city of Calgary, or Mohkinstsis in Blackfoot, which is also the home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I'm really grateful to you, Natalie, for moderating the session. I'm really grateful, Kathy and Douglas at the University of Alberta Press. Thank you to everyone in this panel and to all of the people who participated in the book Dissonant Methods, Undoing Discipline in the Humanities Classroom, co-edited by Jaarsma and myself, and the book that occasions our conversation today. I want to pause a little bit, though, to reflect on a couple of things Natalie just offered. One is we're here to celebrate the University of Alberta Press and this book, but I really couldn't pass over an opportunity to also thank Natalie for the kind publication of How to Make Art at the End of the World, her book on research creation, which I find really animating and really vital. I also really want to note, Natalie, the complexity that you gave to the territorial acknowledgement, I think is a really important element of these conversations. For myself, with family that immigrated, in some cases partly also through Ellis Island, and eventually arrived in Northern Alberta on the boundaries between Treaty 6 and Treaty 8 territory. It's also, I'm reflecting a lot on the virtualization of this year's Congress, but also it's being hosted in Edmonton, a city I know very well and care for deeply. So if that seems like a lengthy list of opening thanks, please do know that it could be a longer list, and that in fact it illustrates a point. Conference sessions, like books and like classrooms, are never guided by singular voices. Rather, they emerge from relationships, from ongoing negotiations, and from pre-existing conditions. So the book that occasions this session, Dissonant Methods, is one such. It's a book of essays and interventions written by scholars who are based in a wide range of humanities disciplines, from English, my own home discipline, to philosophy, Ghada's home discipline, to anthropology, musicology, medieval studies, and more. The book arose from questions about the methods that we use in our classrooms in order to support our students in their learning, and more specifically, where those methods become dissonant or discordant or even disruptive. particularly when put into cross-disciplinary conversations. To speak personally, this book for me arose from a certain form of despair. It was a despair prompted from years of witnessing the impacts of budget cuts on my students and on my colleagues and friends and on myself, many of the conditions that Natalie was invoking. It was a despair born of watching a relentlessly neoliberal mandate of a certain form of efficiency being foisted on universities by governments, by willing administrations, and by disciplinary formations that more readily fit the definitions of desirable contemporary norms, those that can produce particular types of laborers recognized by frequently conservative governments. My despair was also linked to a dawning recognition that my own thinking had become disciplined according to particular sets of normative assumptions within the discipline of English, and that I was complicit in foisting these assumptions onto my own students in turn. Dissonant Methods, though, is much more than these concerns. As my co-editor Ada puts it at the opening of her introduction, she writes, quote, "Methods animate the world of university classrooms as organizing logics that compel and constrain interactions among teachers and students," close quote. So that twinned pairing, compel and constrain, lies, I think, at the heart of this project. How have the methods particular to disciplines compelled students to create new concepts? How have these same methods, though, constrained students and obstructed new discoveries? The contributors to the book, Martin Schuster, Kyle Kinaschuk, Kathy Causey, Eli Shipley, Katja Pettinen, Guy Obrecht, Caitlin Rothberger, Namrata Mitra, and Rachel Jones, several of whom are here today, I see, and I'm really glad to see you all here. The contributors have all risen to the challenge of answering these questions in ways that are specific to their practice. So I continue to be animated by the generosity that they bring to their engagements. And then the pandemic. Dissonant Methods was conceived of and created just prior to the global COVID-19 pandemic. It was published in the fall of 2020 as the pandemic was hitting its half-year mark. We could not have predicted that our classrooms would change so radically and so quickly in order to deal with the necessities of remote learning. The circumstances have been far from ideal. I don't need to, of course, to rehearse that. We all know this so well. So on the one hand, then, Dissonant Methods already requires some amount of fine-tuning in order to think through these times. On the other hand, Dissonant Methods asks questions that have become, to me, even more pressing, given what this long global emergency has brought to us. Many of my own assumptions are challenged in this time. In my afterword to the book, for instance, I wrote the following, quote, "The classroom might be said to be the result of what happens when embodied fleshy beings come together in order to pursue a set of linked questions," end of quote. What happens, however, in a remote environment? What changes are needed to our understanding when the classroom has become precisely disembodied? What kinds of methods might answer to the challenges of this time and to the times to come? So today's roundtable discussion arises from precisely these and other linked questions. We've been grappling with the problem of how to teach meaningfully and effectively at this time. I've endeavored to do so in support of my students and at times against institutional formations that have all too often behaved as though this can be a time of business as usual or as usual as possible. I don't think that it can be business as usual. Too many of my students reported extreme levels of distress during the past year, even as I tried my best to support them. Too many of my colleagues, particularly those in contingent roles, were pressed beyond their capacities. I am personally weary and wanting to look forward to a future in which things may be different. So in this spirit, then I ask, what might lie ahead for post-pandemic pedagogy? I'll end by offering just a very small amount of my own experience during the past year, which will open up to what Ghada, Jaarsma, and Kyle Kinaschuk will offer next. During the winter semester, I taught 3 different courses. Expecting that remote, emergency, or distance delivery may be expected of me again in the future, I decided to experiment with my course design. As you might anticipate, for me, this question of course design revolved around the synchronous, asynchronous axis with which so many of us have been wrestling. I designed one course asynchronously, and then I designed one as a hybrid model, and I ran a third synchronously. And although this is purely anecdotal evidence, what I found was that all 3 modes were functional. In all three cases, what came through from my students, both during the semester and from their evaluations, was that the success of my courses, or the lack thereof, came down to my level of organization, my level of responsiveness to my students' queries, and my level of flexibility and understanding. So, while I want to continue all aspects of this conversation about what post-pandemic pedagogy may look like, I hope that this is a conversation that can be one that's both broad and inclusive, that combines practical insights with the kinds of practices from across the humanities that animates Dissonant Methods. With that, I'd like Ghada and Kyle to take the reins.
Thank you so much, Kit, and thank you so much, everybody who's here. Just in case you, like me, are finding it a little bit of a challenge to continue going on Zoom like we are, it might be nice to read as we are speaking. So Kyle is going to place a link to a Google Doc right now, and I'll just give you a minute to click on it just in case that feels good to you, and then we will present our reflections. This year, I taught a course on Antigone that I'd been dreaming about teaching since grad school. Here's a tiny excerpt from the syllabus. This course will be held online asynchronously. We'll learn philosophy by doing philosophy. This requires time. It takes time for us to notice our own thoughts, to let them deepen, and then to write them out. Every aspect of this course has been designed to allow for great flexibility. You get to decide when you'd like to do each lesson.
In the winter of 2021, I taught my first course, a fourth-year advanced studies seminar on the 1781 Zong massacre, where we collectively studied how various genres and forms, so that's historical studies, court transcripts, long poems, anti-monuments, art installations, and electronic music records, have imagined and reimagined the Zong otherwise. Here's an excerpt from the syllabus. This seminar will be held synchronously via Zoom. As this is a fourth-year advanced studies seminar, most of our thinking will occur during the weekly time we share together. Holding time to collectively analyze and imagine the course materials is vital for the flourishing of a seminar. While there are asynchronous elements to this course, we will strive to respond to one another in real time. I will make available recordings of our weekly sessions, as well as the course material shared in seminar.
As you hear in these excerpts, Kyle and I made different choices about one design problem in particular, the problem relating to the temporality of our respective courses. And we'd like to explore this dissonance with you this morning, the dissonance between the synchronous, meaning inhabiting a shared moment of time together, and the asynchronous, connecting, but across time and across space.
To arrive at this design choice, I circulated an anonymous survey to students with the intention of designing the course in a way that moved beyond accommodating individual learners and to ensure that the course itself was designed more equitably from its inception. The question of time, then, was at the forefront of these considerations, a question that emerged in conversation with Ada. I decided upon a synchronous approach, given that this was the first and only seminar many of these students, a group of 12, would experience as undergraduates. So the feedback that they provided from the survey overwhelmingly pointed toward their desire to be able to meet weekly via Zoom to discuss the reading synchronously and enter into conversation with one another.
Our collection, Dissonant Methods, invites a practice of self-scrutiny for teachers about our own design choices, syllabi, and assumptions about what teaching even is. It's really that latter part that I remained so compelled by. It also invites us to make teaching strange, in part by learning about other teachers, practices, styles, and choices. Making strange can be a way to rethink our choices and designs individually, but it can also be something we undertake collectively in solidarity with students. This is what we'd like to consider and even hopefully practice together here this morning.
In her introduction to Dissonant Methods, Ada writes, "Forms are abstract organizing principles, and they afford different arrangements, relations, and activities." End quote. Teaching in the time of the pandemic has ramped up the necessity for reckoning with time as an operative form in the classroom. Returning to the dissonance Ada and I have staged here, as well as Kit, between the synchronous and the asynchronous, a design choice pivotal to teaching in the time of the pandemic, I wonder how woefully inadequate synchronous is as a descriptor for the time of the classroom. Does synchronous teaching not assume that it is indeed possible to share time with one another? How is time within the classroom lived out differentially? I'm thinking here in particular about the otherwise knowledges, affects, and experiences that both students and techs bring to the classroom, which remain opaque to the university and thus we might say exceed any claim to the synchronous. Put otherwise, how might the shared time of the classroom also contain within it and beyond it many asynchronicities, that's past, presents, and futures, that the classroom itself cannot acknowledge?
We'd like to conclude with a prompt, as teachers like to do. We've been describing Dissonant Methods, which is the title of the collection. We've been describing this as a kind of making strange. The book makes the case for the ever-present possibility of such practices. So in a way, there's a kind of real optimism at the heart of the project. One example from the book, Caitlin Rothberger, who's here this morning, she locates this possibility in the dissidence of students in particular, students who stage refusals in all kinds of generative ways. Likewise, the book is filled with examples of assignments, modes of assessment, lesson plans, and affective strategies that all work to infuse teaching with creative resistance. But the pandemic seems to have offered us new ways of making our teaching strange. Like, for example, the design choice that many or most of us faced, namely to go synchronous or asynchronous with our courses. Kyle has been pointing to the limitations of synchronicity, especially in terms of false ideals of sameness and sharedness. But like any form of practice, gathering together in real time is an affordance that can make all kinds of important things happen, as we ourselves are demonstrating together this morning. And so our prompt for you is threefold. And it's a sincere prompt. I hope we'll have time to talk about it if you would like to. How did you approach the design choice between in real time and offline flexibility in your teaching this year? Now that the school year's over, how would you adjudicate the choices that you made? And are there other ways that teaching has become newly strange to you because of the challenges of the pandemic? We're really excited that other contributors to the book are here, Caitlin Rothberger and Kathy Cossey. Can't wait to hear your thoughts, and also to hear from many authors of the U of A Press who are here and everybody else who's joined us. Thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it off now to Sandra Styres.
And Sandra, I'm just going to stop you and let you know that you are on mute.
Just realized that, sorry.
Yeah, no
I want
worries.
to thank Natalie for that fulsome land acknowledgement and for introducing me. I just want to add to that because I think it's important to understand the complexity of people's stories. And my story is one of complexity. I am Ganya Gahega, English and French. I am a member of the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory community, and I have been living in that community for well over 20 years, raising my family. But my roots specifically came from Southern Quebec, where I was born and raised in Montreal and in that surrounding area. What was once known as the Upper Mohawk Valley. So that's really important to understand that. As we think about education and we think about the complexities of education, we think about the complexities of Indigenous settler relationships, especially right now. And I want to say, because this is a very poignant moment over the past weekend, to ensure that the mention of these 212 children does not end up becoming a sidebar in any kind of discussion. We have to remember that this was a mass grave with some of those children as young as 3 years old. And we don't want this to become a sidebar in Canada's history of colonial or genocidal violence that was conducted in the name of education. And I think that's really important to the discussion at hand today when we talk about dissonant methods and what does that mean in our classrooms. And for me in particular, in my exploration of land-based education and land-based policies, in going into my classrooms and talking about that and talking about reconciliation and how difficult those conversations become when you hear things like, why can't people just get over it? Well, because when you think about not just the history of residential schools, but you think about the ongoing present history of residential schools that is occurring even now. And I say that because our elders and survivors have been talking about children who have died and disappeared and nobody knew what happened to them. Children that were reported to have run away. Children, these survivors have talked about children being buried under the residential school property in mass graves, and nobody believed them. Kamloops is just the start. I know for a fact that where I'm currently living on Six Nations, we have a residential school in Brantford that that people are saying that there are children buried under there. And so there is a lot that has to happen in order to heal that relationship. And again, there has been so many precipices, so many watershed moments where people can step in, the government can step in and do the right things. And even now you hear them, yes, we're committed, but we're wavering on any solid commitments. And I think that that has to be brought into the classroom. And the reason I say that is because in the work that I teach, I tell students, this is going to be a very provocative class. It is going to cause you to confront some of your long cherished myths. It's going to bring you to a place where you may experience emotions, and emotions are not negative or positive. They are sources for learning and an opportunity for us to discuss that. So I look at the pedagogies that I do. I don't call them dissonant pedagogies. I call them pedagogies of resistance. And the initial resistance is what I bring into the classroom. The pedagogies that I bring into the classroom that seek to disrupt those colonial normative narratives, normative discourses within education. And the student responses are quite often resistance to that. So we call them counter resistance because they are countering our resistance to the pedagogy. And it disrupts their thinking. It disrupts their colonial myths of Canada, the benevolent and the good. And it also holds space for students to also confront their own complicitness in the colonial agenda. And there are many ways to do that and to achieve that without an educator standing at the front, confronting students about what they believe and what they don't believe. And that is particularly important for educators who are marginalized in other ways and don't necessarily have the protection of whiteness around them. And so that becomes really important to look at other ways of confronting these narratives and to bring dissonance, if you will, to use the words that are in this book, to create dissonance within the classroom. So there's readings, reading groups, reading reflections, larger group discussions, bringing other first voices into the classroom so that they hear the ways that other Indigenous scholars are speaking about these very things that we're talking about in the classroom. So for instance, showing a film or a documentary that we would then talk about in a sharing circle. I remember one time we were having, usually we talk about residential schools over the course, it builds, so the courses are scaffolded, but the actual module on residential schools is over 2 to 3 weeks and is designed to give, in the introduction course, is designed to give students an introduction into Indigenous Studies 101, if you will. And we showed the film, and then after the film is called We Were Children. Some of you may have seen it already. And it's a very gut-wrenching and heart-wrenching movie to show in a classroom. So as an educator, you're simultaneously ensuring that BIPOC students are protected, that their space is held for them to be protected, to be free from the anguish that may be coming from their other students. And so we have a sharing circle at the end, and quite often the students will express their heartbreak and their gut wrench and all of those things that are a normal part of the learning process in these dissonant moments. As students are trying to come to grips with what they grew up with what they knew to be true. Some have grown up in religious institutions, have grown up in Catholic families, Christian families, Protestant families, and have grown up in the churches and are now have never heard this before and are really struggling to find that place where their belief system can merge with this new reality of what they've just learned. You know, one student says, I can't unsee what I've seen now, and I don't know what to do with that. And then I read them Christos's poem, Not Your Tears. And that's also a very poignant part. And so as we talk about that poem, and it brings even deeper discussions. So these are the kinds of dissonances that can be created that scaffold on themselves, and each, you know, their reading reflections, their journaling, it all culminates, and their in-class work all culminates in a final paper that looks back over their journey throughout the course, and essentially getting them to analyze their learning and what ultimately, what are they taking away from it that they're going to use. And traditionally, that's always been done in a very face-to-face environment where there's real live interaction with people right there in real time. And it's all based on, you know, Indigenous education and this type of pedagogy that's very intense also has to be done in the ethics of relationality. And that those ethics are expressed in relevance, reciprocity, respect, ceremony, and trust. And that is something that is worked to be built as a very purposeful, mindful community within that classroom space. So when we were asked to pivot, and I'm not going to speak to the first time we were asked to pivot because there were only 2 weeks left in the term. So the learning community had already been established and built, and we were just doing the last 2 weeks, you know, to catch up. So that really didn't change anything. But we were talking about, I'm talking about the last term that we had to do this past year. And I initially had, so I moved from fully face-to-face to a hybrid because I felt very strongly that we still needed that face-to-face interaction, even if it was online. And then I built in some asynchronous components where they could go off and do some of the work on their own. What was really interesting is unanimously across all the courses that I taught, the students came back and asked if we could do it fully synchronous. They did not like the asynchronous component. They felt that too many of their classes were disconnected. Too many of them were either fully asynchronous or had asynchronous components, and they really missed that human interaction that brought them. So of course, what we missed was the ceremony that we would have at the beginning of each class, and how do we create that? So we did do a sharing circle, but it really sort of missed some of the more important components of ceremony, such as, in our case, it would have been smudging, it would have been all those passing of the feather, it would have been different kinds of ceremony that we would hold in the first 20 minutes of class. So we moved to a fully synchronous format for the entire time, and the students really, really appreciated that. So what is my pedagogy going to look like post-pandemic? I don't think it's going to change all that much because of the fact that I've blended a lot of online with the in-class part of it. So I think for me, it's just really sort of creating that, continuing to create that atmosphere that not only holds space for people to examine their complicitness, but also holds space where BIPOC students can feel safe and secure in that very same environment when multiple things are happening all at once. So you really are having to juggle many balls in the air, and then, but also having to keep the students grounded, having to always bring them back. Yes, it's important that we look at how we look at history. How in the world did we get here? Then we have to look at where we are, and we can't look at where we're going if we haven't looked at where we've been and how we've got here. The thing that also complicates the going forward are the many steps back we sometimes have to take in order to continue to look at where we've been, and where we've been brought us to where we are now. And the mass graves at Kamloops are one example of that happens. You can also point to Joyce Equishon. You can point to John Styres. You can point to Colton Boushey, Tina Fontaine, Cindy Gladue. Like, I mean, we can go on and on and on. And all of those sometimes require us not just going forward, always forward, but there's this back and forth that needs to happen as we continually examine and take those steps forward, but also knowing that we're going to have to go back and look at some of that in order to comprehend how to move forward in positive and respectful relations. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. And I'm going to pass the baton on to Ghada to close us out, and then open back up to fulsome discussion prompted by all of these really moving provocations. Ghada, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Natalia, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for the University of Alberta for organizing this event, and for all of you for making the time to attend this very much important and timely book and topic. And it's really my pleasure to take part in this panel. In the coming 12 or 15 minutes or so, I intend to talk about teaching practices drawing from my own experience teaching undergrad at the University of Alberta Political Science Department, and end briefly with touching on some of the challenges we face as a result of the pandemic. However, before delving into the topic, I would like to confirm what has been actually stressed and affirmed by one of the contributors to this volume, that education comes with huge responsibility that transcends and surpasses the narrow understanding of education as a process to prepare students for the market, for the world of labor force, a world of money and jobs. And while I'm not denying that the concern of education or the goals, the tasks is touching on that as well, but the ultimate goal, or the one of the aims of education, is to open spaces for thinking, spaces to practice critical thinking, to create critical thinkers, and especially in humanities and social sciences, and a space to raise those difficult questions, those uncomfortable questions, those unthought questions. And education is also the process that attempts to disrupt, as Sandra has mentioned, and confound this habitual way of thinking, or the mainstream traditional way of looking at things, and a process that assists in fueling the motor of a change and motivate improvement both at the individual, but also at the collective level and society level, and ultimately a process of human emancipation. So in this context, the responsibility of educators is not only to offer a space for thinking, but also to enlarge this space to include everyone, especially the silenced groups, who often, together with their narrative, with their versions of the story, got excluded by various systems and structures of power. And I always remember the conversation that I had with a trustee of one of the major Western mainstream media or papers back home when I used to work as interpreter or fixer in media, when he told me that we as a paper determine what conversation would Tony Blair and George Bush would have the next morning. That was at the time, at the beginning of the 2000s. We not only determine, I mean, of course, when their media advisors come to brief them in the breakfast, but also we determine who's in that conversation, who's in and who's out. I always remember this thing and remember the responsibility of the educator that we should include or bring those neglected issues and neglected narrative and put them back on the table, the marginalized voices who get often omitted or misrepresented in the mainstream corporate media, and to some extent by scholarship too, we have to admit so. So the master in delivering this method of the critical thinking, of the questioning, of raising those uncomfortable questions is the philosopher Socrates, who himself know nothing, or actually not know nothing, who published nothing or wrote nothing, but or even claimed, he did not claim that he possessed the knowledge, but actually searching for the truth and the answers for those difficult questions by pointing to the issues and encourage his audience, mainly young people, students, but also those elite or those in power at their time to enter into that conversation. So in challenging these systems and established beliefs and the structure of power, Socrates aimed to improve the society and change it for the better, a task that ultimately, as we know, cost him his life as he got executed for daring to think or encouraging others to think or raise the question or searching for answers. So sadly, these systems and structures are still alive and operates well in our society. System that justifies brutality, violence in the name of keeping the law and order, or in the name of protection and public safety, as was the case with George Floyd, with Michael Brown, with Colton Bucci, etc. A system that criminalizes victims and glorify colonizers, and deprive indigenous people from their basic rights to live free on their land, and justify the military occupying power crimes, as the case in Palestine and Gaza. System and establishment that demonize and criminalize groups such as Native and indigenous people, but also Black people and Arabs, Muslims, and portray them as aliens who are unable to parent, to govern themselves, or view them as potential threat or demographic threat, etc. So, and to untangle these threads of these issues and to travel this way of habitual thinking and established narrative, and to make sense of the world we live in, I try to adopt two strategies. First, dismantle these barriers between disciplines, or in other words, linking these disciplines so that we can generate a proper understanding of the issues around us, but also in the world, and also the dynamics of the politics. Social work or social sciences, as Marx brilliantly puts it, should be taught and should be thought of and analyzed as totality, which means dismantling these existing barriers between and among academic divisions of social world, be it history, economy, political science, sociology, etc. And doing so would not only help the student to describe the issues at hand, but also to diagnose and think of solutions and ways of a change. So when we discuss a case such as George Floyd or the current event, or not actually crime, the 215 children whose bodies have been discovered underneath the residential school in Kamloops in BC, the theories, the terminology, the topics that ought to be brought in the discussion or to lead the thinking include but not limited to racism, race theory, system of power, settler colonialism, neoliberal project, mainstream media, human rights, indigenous rights, discrimination, history of residential schools, social movement, community actions, power from below and way to resist this ongoing crimes. So the second strategy that I used is to connect with the students. And this is something that I missed and lost, to be honest, during the pandemic. And because I used to do it using different techniques in order to make learning enjoyable and experience, but hopefully unforgettable one. So the shortest way to connect with the students, in my view, is creating this positive and welcoming classroom in which knowledge is passed on, blended with stories, with passion, with case studies, with examples, with a question to think of, with this lecturer or people with experience or expertise. So when we talk about refugees or refugee issue or crisis, we should host a former refugee here in Edmonton, be it a Somali or a Palestinian or a Syrian, to tell about their story, the original version of the story. When we speak about the legacy of the residential schools, we should invite one of the survivors or their descendants to talk about this. So I strongly believe that the shortest way between human being is a story, and I owe it to my grandmother, who used to tell me as a refugee stories every night about our life, about our lost homeland, about our tradition, rich culture, and hope, and how we should live with hope despite the odds, and to work, to follow such hope by actions. So she narrated the stories and passed knowledge with passion and with care. And to this moment, I could repeat her stories and movements while telling them to my children and to my students. I used the same philosophy with my students to let them, live the experience of learning and opening these small windows, which we can look at the world to describe it, to interpret it, to diagnose the issues and attempt to think and offer solution if we can. Drawing from different approaches and philosophers and scholars, starting from Prophet Muhammad, a champion of the human rights, who said 1500 years ago that all of us, all the human beings are equal like the teeth of the comb. There is no difference between Arab and non-Arab, black and white, but by piety and by good deeds. Marx, who said, philosopher just interpreted the world. Our job as learner is to change it. Gandhi, be the change you want to see in the world. Think and revisit your thinking and act. Or, Ihsan or Hamid Dabashi, scholarship can non-European thing. So with no doubt, let me use this last few minutes to reflect on the pandemic challenges that we face all as educators. And with no doubt that pandemic has affected learning and teaching. And we, as we no more have this full access and supervision of learning environment or access to the actual classroom or the human interaction, I no more see or feel or assess the learning outcome as I used to do when I used, to be in a class. I no more can see the reflections of the students, be it in body language, such as raised eyebrows or sighs or nodding or refusing or rejecting. I no more can tell if they are satisfied with the learning, if they are embarrassed, if they are sad. So this is one of the issues that really present a challenge for teaching after pandemic. The other issue, of course, is the challenge of international students who live in different time zones, and and particularly I try to give synchronous part, especially in political science. You need to have the conversation, and they find the time as an issue. It is also the power outage of that happens in places here, but most of the time in places such as Middle East or Africa. The stress at our end as educators, because of the hundreds of emails that you need to respond to and respond timely. Because in class, we used to sort these questions right after or before the lecture. Now, all of this coming in this terms of emails, even marking the papers itself, it's become a huge task, because as myself, I used to, get the hard copy and write the comments. Now you have to spend long time behind the screens to read and write the comments online so that students could see how they did in this paper. So different sorts of the challenges, but most importantly is the level of engagement of the students, and the interaction that I see is very low, no matter what I try to do in order to engage them. So I won't make it longer, leave it probably for discussion. And thank you for listening.
Thank you for that, Ghada. And thank you everyone for being here with us this morning for this conversation. I am now going to open it up to all of us for discussion and represent some of the key question fields that have been presented to us here this morning. They're overlapping kind of Venn diagram fields. One is the question of why it might matter to render dissonant and to unsettle our disciplinary and pedagogical norms. And I'm kind of asked, and I'm also, for me, that occurs as a particularly potent question, especially as we proceed through the ranks, right? So what does it mean to propose, as Ada does in the introduction to her book, method as form? And why does it matter to attend to method as form that in material ways works to solicit different pedagogical and political possibilities in the classroom and in our research, different pedagogical and political possibilities that I think what I want to present here is the difference, is the ways that oftentimes our pedagogical methods and our research methods, especially as we move through the ranks and become settled in our ways of doing, how they often can, without our intention, but simply through habit, work in service of the neoliberal settler state. So what does it mean to continually call ourselves to account to unsettle and to unsettle, especially those of us who have kind of grown up and been trained as those who say they are committed to radical and critical pedagogy? So how do we do that in ongoing, anew ways that can sometimes be uncomfortable? How to do that? Why does it matter? And linked to this, but not limited to it, how do we enact forms of ethical and political kind of action across the academy in ways that are accountable to the intersecting crises of the present, which includes the requirement to grapple with the genocide upon which our classrooms are founded, as well as the texture of the spaces that we're creating within our classrooms, and how, and this is a question that, as many of our panelists have pointed out, has become particularly acute under COVID conditions, under pandemic conditions. So with that put into the space, Ada and Kit, in organizing this panel, wanted to invite us not only to respond to questions that the panelists are raising in the abstract, but also in terms of our concrete experiences. our experiences in the classrooms ourselves, all of us. So I'll invite us all to raise our hands if we'd like, and to share or offer a provocation or a reflection or a question for one of our panelists or all of our panelists. And I will keep a speaker list if there's a plethora of hands that jump up. If you are the only hand raised, please unmute, turn on your video if that's available to you, and jump on in. And as difficult as it is, let's try in the next 24 minutes or so to create a roundtable dialogic feel within the constraints of Zoom. And I recognize that that is a daunting task. And as everyone is gathering their thoughts, I'm going to start by asking the panelists, as well as the three contributors to the volume who are here in the room, Rachel Jones, Caitlin Rothberger, and Kathy Cossey, to start us off, kick the ball off by responding to each other.
That's a big order. I'm Kathy Cossey. I'm coming today from Mi'kma'ki, from Halifax, and it's in the Peace and Friendship Treaty. And I'm a medievalist. And so the contribution I made to the volume was about that moment in teaching when your lesson plan goes out the window. And it's a really exciting moment, but you're suddenly thinking really quickly and you're making connections and you're into crazy uncharted territories that sometimes really works and sometimes really doesn't. And so that is what I was talking about in the volume. But my experience this year in the pandemic, we at Dalhousie, we were supposed to go entirely asynchronous for very good reasons. People with technological problems, bandwidth problems, privacy concerns, all of that. But if you can't tell by the fact that I unmuted first, I'm a raging extrovert, and I couldn't handle the thought of teaching for a year without some sort of interaction. So I held in the first term in the fall entirely optional tutorials online, synchronous, and they were just, you could get participation marks through participating in those, but you could also participate in the discussion boards or whatever. So there were entirely asynchronous ways of participating. And I found that synchronous, like I did it for me, but it really helped a portion of the class as well. And so what I did in the second term is I built in that synchronicity. And so I think when I'm thinking about what learning I will take from the pandemic experience back into the classroom, if we ever get back, and what I want to bring from this year, it will be two things. So one is that communication and connection is important. And it has to be some sort of, I'm sure you can create that connection asynchronously, but synchronous works best. And creating the safe spaces to have, I mean, what are the humanities for if not to have these tough conversations and questions. And so you need to have that. And I think Sandra spoke to this and so on. You need to have that safe space in which to bring those questions, and that takes time to build. But the other thing I learned this term was that I was basically throwing everything at the student. I tried podcasting, I tried lecturing, I tried asynchronous, I tried synchronous, I tried everything and saw what stuck. And so Kit talked about flexibility. And I think I need to be more willing to be flexible in the actual classrooms. And one of the things I did this term, because we were in the middle of a global pandemic, and I really was flexible in my marking. So I gave options, and I gave lots of options, and let the students choose, kind of assemble a menu of marks, okay, that they could build. And so they could, I found that students either liked having everything at, in one or two big assignments and saw the rest as busy work. Other students were freaked out by the idea that all of their marks would come at the end of the term at the same time. And so I gave two paths. I made sure that they each fulfilled the teaching and pedagogical objectives, that they were kind of equivalent, but the students really responded to that. And so that's something I'll keep. And it made my marking easier as well, because it spread out the marking and so on. But I don't know why I hadn't thought of that option in person, but it took the pandemic to teach that to me. So those are a few things I've learned from this pandemic experience that are positive things.
Thank you, Kathy. I have instructions from the chat bar to jump in because my hand is up. So I'm just going to lower my hand and say that I have been teaching nonstop since March. I only get every third summer off, so I don't get a break until summer of 2022. I have been learning an awful lot about what works and what doesn't. And I am just coming to the end of a term as what's called a faculty teaching fellow position, where I am supporting others in how they are doing their teaching. And that's meant that my work for that changed a lot this semester too, this past year, I mean, too. And one of the things that I am quite proud of that I did, if you will allow me to share a screen, is come up with this infographic which advises people to reduce, organize, communicate, and be kind in how they're designing their courses, not just during the pandemic, but it was for the purposes of the pandemic. And I struggle sometimes to take my own advice, especially when it comes to reducing my own workload. But I think that the biggest lesson I have learned is to do less, do it well, but do less. So I love the fact that we can take this moment to learn to do things better, but I urge people not to try everything at once and to take small steps. Thank you.
Caitlin, jump on in.
Hi, I'm going to also lower my hand. So I contributed to the book that Ada and Kit edited as an undergraduate at the time. I'm now a PhD candidate in the Department of Cultural Studies at McMaster. And at the time of writing it, I was really interested in the metaphor of the tomato that's used and thinking about pedagogies being like dropped or mishandled or otherwise used by students, especially in ways that were not intended, and what that can do to the classroom space. So thinking about the panelists today, Ada and Kit used the metaphor of dissonance, Sandra used the metaphor of resistance in teaching, and a professor at my university, Gina Zarowski, talks about mutiny and thinking about the ivory tower being a metaphor that's derived from colonial plunder and the legacy of that and how we can disentangle through acts of mutiny in the classroom. And I really liked what Sandra said about bringing other voices into the classroom. So this semester I taught as a TA the history of colonial writing in Canada, but it was taught for the first time at my university by an Indigenous woman. So she was foregrounding Indigenous writers at the time. And one of the things I've really enjoyed about Zoom while teaching this is the opportunity to bring other voices into the classroom, because in in-person teaching, I'm really resistant to using technology. I don't understand how to utilize it, and I get very easily embarrassed in front of my younger students trying to navigate it, which makes me want to die. But having to learn Zoom in this way, I found it a lot easier to bring these other voices in. And something coming from cultural studies I've been really interested in is what happens outside of the university. So Ada talked about learning philosophy by doing philosophy. And I've been trying to think about learning cultural studies by doing cultural studies, which sometimes has meant over this past year, pausing the planned lesson to talk about what happened in the world. So I was teaching a class the day of the Georgia massage parlor shootings. And reading Joseph Brandt didn't align with that in any way and didn't feel important at the time. So being on Zoom, we were able to pause the lesson, read some of the writings that were being put out by Asian American authors and reflect on that, I think, in a way that felt a lot more productive than like the smooth terrain of an ordered syllabus. So I was wondering if I'm allowed to pose a question, how everyone thinks about like the platform of Zoom or technology in particular, about like enabling us to bring other voices or other perspectives in that maybe we wouldn't ordinarily.
That's a great question, and I know it's certainly made it more accessible for people who had disabilities or you know, other barriers, and for people who were working at the same time, because in this neoliberal academy you need to take on a second job because you can't just work in the summers like we could when I was a student. And so some of the advantages for asynchronous and, you know, distance learning were really impressive for the people who had other barriers to education. And I'd really like to brainstorm with people ways we can keep those going.
If there are other students here, it would be so amazing to hear, because I feel like a kind of guilty conscience, I think, when talk about teaching goes too far without really foregrounding the essential, creative, disruptive, wonderfully demanding, when people are interested, voices of students. So anyway, I just mainly wanted to thank Caitlin for reminding us of how utterly essential that is. And especially I'd just love to hear from students in addition to everybody else during this roundtable.
Marie-Josée, jump in.
Okay, first of all, I just want to say my first language is French, so if I don't use the right terminology or whatever, I'm taking a big risk here, but I'm gonna do it. So first of all, thank you everybody for sharing. This is very interesting. I see that I may not be teaching exactly the same kind of content of courses as those people that shared, but what I want to say is that what I learned from this year is I actually saw my students every course, but I limited the time. So instead of having the 2 or 3 hour course, I had some video that they had to watch before, and I learned you had to reduce it by a maximum of 15 minutes. So I did that on YouTube, and that did help a lot of my students, because some of them, French is not their first language. You know, I teach at the University of St. Boniface in Winnipeg. And then so with that, you can see the subtitles, you can slow down the speed of the video, and you can go back and watch the videos again. So that really learned. And they watched this prior to the class, but that was built within the time slot. So I had the open door kind of concept that they could drop by, and then you could watch it for those ones that like to sleep in. You could watch it the night before or whatever. So that really helped. And then the time within class, I probably talked 10%, if that. That was their time, but I really framed the discussion with, you know, sentence, organizers, let's say, and sentence stems, like beginning to start the, you know, so I actually found the participation of students has increased. I did not have one person that was not participating in small groups. In large groups, yes, it was a little trickier, but in small groups, it was 100% that people were participating because it was so framed and within a small time period, which was an hour long. And then after, I created a menu where the students could go and further their learning, let's say, so they can go and watch a video of what it looks like a lesson on reading in Quebec or in Ontario and so on, with different accents in French and, you know, and expressions and so on, because the part is that the French culture and the French language, you know, that's part of your education in, you know, this community of learning. And I was really trying to offer that or create this in a virtual way. So I found that that menu actually really helped. And the last thing I will share, I don't want to take everybody's time, is that a colleague and I, Gail Comey and I, we did a little ethnographic study, and then we did, they called vignettes. So we kind of, reflected on how COVID and the pandemic has made us change or adjust the way we teach, but to continue having this oral interaction, between students during class time. And we had two different models, let's say. We reflected afterwards, but we had more things in common than differently. And we both found that we learned a lot, and there's a lot of the practices or the pedagogical gestures that we have learned, have done, that we will continue to do post-pandemic, no matter what that looks like. But that's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Michael, jump on in.
Sorry, can you hear me? Fantastic. I just wanted to kind of jump in on the call for like students and such. My name is Michael. I just finished up my undergrad at the University of Toronto, going into my master's now, so exciting news. But in terms of like the call for students, having taken like a seminar-based course prior to the pandemic, and then a seminar course within the pandemic as well, as much as like, by all means, the seminar course prior to the pandemic was, of course, there was a great deal of discussion, there was a great deal of conversation. And going into the pandemic, the seminar course had more students and such. So like there was a fear going around, of course, with like that there would be less discussion, but it was so interesting to see how many people were willing to share. Of course, cameras may not have been on all the times and such, but like it really created, as you were saying, like this room for discussion, and everyone was willing to share their thoughts, willing to share their beliefs. They were willing to take on challenging subjects. And it was interesting to see how many people were willing to and waiting, like where you would look into the raised hand function and see that there would be 8, 9, 10 people waiting with raised hands, ready to prepared to share and ready to join in on the conversation. So I have to say it was really interesting to see how that actually translated into the seminar-based learning in a synchronous but online situation.
Thanks for that, Michael. I'm going to take your hand down. We'll give the good pause so people will have time to find their buttons if they want. So I want to ask the panelists and everyone, I'll try and synthesize some of the questions that you can see going in the chat, but there are two sets of things that are happening concurrently here in the conversation, and I want to point to them and kind of recognize the importance of doing these things together when often they are kind of wrenched apart, which is on the one hand, we're sharing experiences and tips and techniques, and also, reflecting on how we understand, how we were trained to understand our jobs as pedagogues in the classroom, how all of that was defamiliarized and kind of called into question and re-articulated in the face of COVID technologies. All of the concerns about that really they have been exacerbated under COVID, but are clearly a part of what it means to work in the university today, which is being asked continually to do more with less, to do more with less, to do more with less, be more adaptable, be more available. And that beautiful PDF that it was Nikki Didichet shared with us, right? Asking us to reduce, right? Which of course brings up a really interesting tension, right? Between the kind of tips and techniques and the methods and the technologies that we're using in the classroom and our commitment to our disciplinary kind of formations, and then our political commitments in the university, which is of course the intersection that the book addresses, right? Because the moment that I'm asked to reduce, I'm like, yes, we must reduce, make this sustainable for ourselves, each other, and our students. And at the same time, I'm called to confront my commitment to the disciplinary literacies that I love and that I kind of want to share with my students. And then the realization that this semester isn't long enough to actually train them in the way that I was trained, at the same time as politicizing and individualizing and rendering kind of civically vibrant and capacious the classroom. That is opening space for current events, for what's happening, for individualizing everything. And so that requires rethinking exactly what we're doing in the University of, as the University of Alberta is calling it, the University of Tomorrow. Right? What is the University of Tomorrow is in fact one of the questions that we're urgently asking. So I wanted to kind of summarize some of what I'm seeing in the chat and that intersection. And maybe in the last 4 minutes, return to kind of Kit and Ada and the panelists and just ask if there are any final comments on all of this that you would like to share. We have officially 4 minutes before we're being asked to close the session.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Maybe I can come in briefly there, and I've been trying to respond in chat as well. There are more points than we can possibly respond to. I was trying to respond both to Lucia and Aruna's, I think, really important points around some of the frictions and tensions around surveillance technologies and around the normalization of some of these emergency teaching measures that I find really troubling. I suppose one of the things I'd like to talk about as we head towards running out of our time is the contribution that Kyle Kinaschuk made to the book, to Dissonant Methods, which is an essay that has continued to animate my thinking. Kyle writes in his chapter about the event and ways in which, it's really like how Kathy was talking about, the unexpected moment in the classroom, and Caitlin was talking about as well, right? Those unexpected moments either in the classroom or prompted by external events where what was on the syllabus today goes out the window and something else comes in to replace it. And those can be the moments where really meaningful engagement and learning happens. And it requires a kind of flexibility on the part of instructors and of students and everyone participating in those spaces. And, thinking about post-pandemic pedagogies, in a sense, those really important moments that in my own teaching have always taught me so much are the ones I want to find ways to hold on to. It's clear that pedagogy is shifting in this time, and I don't know exactly what the dictates are likely to be from university administrations, but finding ways to hold on to those productive tensions, productive moments, and make space for those moments of grief when they're necessary in the class, or those moments of learning, uncovering, doing something unexpected, those kinds of things. I really want to find ways to hold on to those in particular. So I'm really thankful to everyone who's brought those moments into our conversation today.
And I'm feeling very appreciative, especially of the richness of the chat. So the importance of thinking about the carceral structures that are part of what it means to be at a university, especially that turning the dial up on surveillance, the grossly inequitable labor practices at all of our universities, which continue to get worse, and the neoliberal impulses that all of our schools are just going for. Arun is referring to UFC. I think we can all recognize it. So it can feel so overwhelming. Radha helped so much, I think, this morning, invoking Socrates, invoking Marx, reminding us of these rich resources to situate ourselves in these alienating and oppressive structures. So I'm going to take that away as a reminder of the work that we can continue to do conceptually as essential to also the creative pedagogies that we're all, I think, committed to exploring and inventing.
And I think that is a beautiful note to end on as we hit 10:25 and we take a moment to not be kind of too policed by time, but also recognize that everybody needs time to stretch before they go to their next panel if they're going to one. I want to thank Sandra and Radha and Kyle and Ada and Kit, all of the participants, everyone who shared, everyone who listened, everyone who thought, everyone who's here today, and affirm our kind of joint commitment to a university of tomorrow that is worth staying in and not abdicating from. An insurgent, how to become insurgents within the university is maybe what I'm taking away from this panel. And I thank you all. Oh, maybe we can unmute if everyone's willing to unmute and maybe just give a clap and have a little bit of that oral feeling that we used to have. Thank you all. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you so much.
Well done. I thought that went really well. Oh, mic's up here. There we go. I thought that went really well.
Kate, I was tempted to even put you on the spot. It's like, what students are here? I know what student is here, but I didn't. But thank you for
okay.
being here and for helping us. Natalie, thanks for being such a brilliant moderator. I'm so filled with gratitude.
Oh, the mic's muted. Classic.
You know, I do it at least once a day.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to stay on and just say thanks, Ada. It's really great to be here and have the opportunity to do this. Just remind ourselves of, you know, it's like I'm kind of trying to, I'm imagining a new kind of, I don't know, critical consciousness raising as it when it comes to teaching in the future of the university at this moment, some kind of maybe, you know, cross institution, because what's happening here in Alberta is very specific, right? And
Specific and
I think,
urgent. Yeah.
And there's something about being able to have these conversations that it's not the first time we're having them, right? But that doesn't mean they don't need to be happening anew and ongoingly.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And so thank you for starting that off, and maybe we can, you know, touch base about something ongoing.
I would love that.
Okay. All right.
Thanks.
Have a great day. Ciao.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Bye. Thanks.